A group of MPs and leading medics and scientists are calling for a review of the child vaccination programme, specifically for 12 to 15-year-old healthy children. In a letter being sent to members of the Joint Committee on Vaccines and Immunisation, the group will say the benefit to risk ratio of child vaccination should be reassessed in the light of the Omicron variant and the new evidence on both vaccine harms and superior natural immunity. We urge, they say, the JCVI to review this new evidence and provide updated advice to the government with regards to mass vaccination of healthy 12 to 15-year-olds. In a moment, we'll be speaking to one of those signatories of that letter, Professor Brent Taylor, who was a member of the JCVI for 9 years. But first, let's speak to MP Miriam Cotes, Conservative member for Penistone and Stocksbridge, who has coordinated this campaign. So, morning, Miriam. First of all, what's in the letter and why did you coordinate it?
So the letter is basically asking the JCVI to do an up-to-date review of the evidence in terms of what are the benefits to children of vaccination and what are the potential risks, and to provide updated advice to government as a result. So back in September, when we decided to roll out vaccination to healthy 12 to 15-year-olds, everybody understood that it was a very marginal decision. We hoped that there would be some reduction in transmission. That was the reason we pushed ahead with it. We knew there wasn't a great benefit to children health-wise because they're at such low risk, fortunately, from COVID. And we did know that there were some very rare but quite concerning side effects from vaccination to that age group, which the JCVI were very clear on. So we've understood that the benefits have been marginal. I think it's interesting that around 50%, I think slightly fewer than 50% of 12 to 15s have had that first jab. So I think that parents and children understand that it was a very marginal decision. But as you said, over recent weeks, with the Omicron variant becoming dominant and also with some new studies about the risks, I wonder if that balance has actually shifted. So it's possible now that vaccination doesn't really reduce the risk of transmission. Of course, it still provides excellent protection against severe disease. So it's brilliant for people who are at risk from COVID. But if it doesn't protect against transmission, that reduces the benefits of vaccinating children. And if we know a bit more about the potential harms, then we need to look at those too. So just as the JCVI announced yesterday an update in whether or not they were going to recommend a fourth dose, they're not. I want them to have another look at the evidence for children, just to make sure that if we are vaccinating children, it is genuinely in their best interests.
Miriam, you're a mother and you're a former teacher. What would you want the outcome to be?
Well, in the first instance, I want the outcome to be that we are looking at the best data and that if we are going to press ahead with vaccinating children, it genuinely is in their best interest. But I think my wider concerns are that throughout the course of this pandemic, I don't think we have put our children's interests at the top. I think if we just look at what's happened with school closures and lockdown and restrictions, our children have paid the highest price in this pandemic for the least reward. And it breaks my heart seeing what's happened, not just to my own children, but my constituents' children. And every day, new information emerges, doesn't it, about the harms that they've experienced. And my concern was that in September, the way we decided to roll out vaccination to children was another example of that, because for all other age groups, the government just accepted the JCVI's advice on vaccination. But for children, the JCVI did say that they weren't able to recommend a mass vaccination programme for 12 to 15-year-olds because they were concerned about these extremely rare but unknown risks. But the government pushed ahead anyway. They asked the CMO to look at wider benefits, which is fair enough. But again, that didn't happen for other cohorts for adults. So my wider concern in this pandemic is that instead of putting our children's interests first, because they are vulnerable, we have sometimes subjugated their interests to the interests of adults. So I just want to make sure that that doesn't happen anymore, and that if we are vaccinating children, it is genuinely in their best interests.
Miriam, thank you for that, and please do stay with us. As you said, it was a letter that was coordinated by yourself. Eminent scientists and medics have signed it. I'm going to be brutally honest, Philip and I have signed it as well, but we do want to hear every point of view there. But let's bring in Professor Brent Taylor, and he's the Professor of Community Child Health, UCL, Gt Ormond St Institute of Child Health, and a former JCVI member. So, a letter you're writing to the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunology. Why?
Why? Because I very strongly agree with the sentiments of the letter. I think it's important, first of all, to say, of course, that vaccination is a great good, and it's done enormous benefit to saving lives and to preventing suffering in millions and millions of people. However, the COVID vaccination for children is very difficult to see the justification for, and even more difficult to support.
So what is the evidence that makes you want to relook at this?
Well, it's partly the fact that the original justification was, at best, marginal benefit. The Chief Medical Officer and the government decided to overrule the recommendation of the JCVI last September, and on the basis of that it might keep children in school longer, or there might be some slight reduction in serious illness. But both of those are a bit equivocal. It's difficult to see. The main reason children, of course, have been out of school has very little to do with COVID, but more to do with regulations, which one could be a little uncertain about the justification for in most cases. And secondly, the condition has changed. I mean, the Delta variant was obviously a more severe
and
variant,
Omicron is?
whereas the Omicron is nothing like as severe as it was. Mm-hmm. So the ground rules have changed, as well as that there has been increasing evidence that the side effects are more notable than they were thought to be. Certainly the heart inflammation, the cardiomyopathy, both the lining of the heart and the muscle in the heart is actually more common than it was. And there's been recent evidence last week from one of the big health maintenance organizations in America, the Kaiser Permanente, that the official record is in fact probably deficient by anything up to 30 or 40% of the real incidence when you look at the individual cases on the record.
That's a pretty high number, isn't it?
It is indeed.
And it's not something that we
it's not a very high number. It's still a pretty rare complication. But nevertheless, it's a risk. It's a risk. And you need to, as always with vaccinations, and indeed any medical intervention, you have to balance the benefits against the risks.
Can I ask you, what is the risk of COVID to this age group?
Well, the risk of COVID is probably quite high, but the risk of severe COVID and the risk of dying is infinitesimal. Mm-hmm. It is really very small indeed.
But when we talk about the risk of COVID, we talk about the risk of getting a cold at the moment with Omicron. Is that the type of risk?
It might be slightly more than the cold, but nevertheless, in terms of dying, I mean, a 5-year-old has something like 1,000th the chance of dying from COVID as does an 85-year-old.
Right.
Okay. On that point, though, I mean, the letter refers to the unknown long-term effects of the vaccination on children, but people might ask about the unknown long-term effects of COVID on children. What would you say? What would you say to that?
Well, let's deal with the long-term effects. We just do not know, of course, but nevertheless, quite a number of side effects following vaccinations have only been discovered months or even years after the vaccine was introduced. Mm-hmm. The usual run-in period for a new vaccine for children is about 2 years and up to 10 years. This vaccine has been introduced in a remarkably short period of time, perhaps some might say too rapid length of time, with pretty limited testing, both in adults in the first instance and indeed particularly in children. I think the benefits to children are minuscule. The risks to children, although unknown, are still sufficiently severe, those we do know about, to make it very difficult to support vaccinating this age group.
The authorities say that vaccinating children can help control the spread of the virus to other people who are more vulnerable, such as perhaps elderly family members. Is that not something that's a benefit in itself?
I don't think the evidence is very strong to support that view. And there's another point. I mean, generally speaking, we'd like to adults should protect children. I don't think there's really much of a case for children to have to protect adults.
In the letter, in effect, it says that the chance of myocarditis for children from the vaccine is, if my maths are right, 0.005%.
That's about 5 per million.
Is this such an issue
well,
that you may cause, by doing this letter, you may cause people to question the merits of the vaccination, which as you said at the start, has been a great success. Do you think that minuscule risk that you acknowledge is a minuscule risk is worth sort of undermining perhaps the message on vaccination?
Personally, I don't. I think any significant risk, and this is a significant risk, is really not worth taking, both for the generality, which is your point, but also for the specific justification for this vaccine.
And Philip, if you ask me as a mother of sons, do I think that that's a minuscule risk? No, I don't. I don't feel it's a minuscule, and I think that's why a lot of the mothers, and we can tell parents have not taken up this vaccine. It's only 50% of parents have taken it up. You know, we've managed to have a little think about it as mothers of what we think about that. So I do think that it's really good that these questions are being asked because we want as much information as we can. As you said, things are changing all the time. It's changed a lot with Omicron. The data's changing, the science is changing, and this is such a new vaccine that it's a great thing that these questions are being aired out and being asked.
Would you accept that you are sort of on the in a minority view amongst scientists, amongst medics, around the world, that actually, you know, if you look at the US Centre for Disease Control and Prevention, they say the COVID vaccine for children is safe and effective, and they even recommend it for children between the ages of 5 to 11. So would you? And
they're thinking of introducing it for children between 1 and 5.
Yeah. So do you?
I don't think that's justified at all.
But do you accept that that your view is a minority view, or is your view more widespread than people will admit?
I believe and hope that my view is more widespread than people will admit. But certainly the official view is very much along the lines that COVID vaccine is safe and beneficial for everyone, which is a fairly extreme claim.
Did you agree at the time when the JCVI gave their opinion, which was not to recommend the sort of mass sort of rollout to healthy 12 to 15-year-olds, did you agree with the fact that the Chief Medical Officer was going to look at wider issues, like maybe not being in school or impacts on their education? Did you believe that was correct, that they should have looked at that issue, the wider issue for children to get the vaccine?
Well, they might have considered it, but I mean, that really is outside the remit of an organisation like the JCVI, and it certainly becomes then a political decision.
And as a politician, I would say we would look at everything in the round 360 degrees. So you've got to balance it up. So did you think that wasn't for the Chief Medical Officer to look at? That should have been a political decision? Do you have an issue with the fact that they looked at the wider issue on a sort of a balance of probabilities?
I'm not sure that they did, but and I'm not certain that the Chief Medical Officer made the right decision.
And has this been done before for any other vaccine, looking at wider issues rather than just the medical issues of a vaccine?
Oh, yes, indeed. Yeah. I think one does. One
always
does. You always have to. It's always a balance between the wider benefits as well as the specific benefits. But against that must always be counted both the risks, both the wider risks as well as the specific risks.
Mm-hmm. And I'll bring Miriam Cotes back in, the MP who's coordinate this, because like you said, it's not just you signing this letter as an eminent professor and from the medical profession. Lots have signed this. So Miriam, as I said, this was an exclusive for GB News today. You're sending this letter off. When do you think you'll get a reply? We would like to have the GCVI on the programme as well to hear what they've got to say. When do you think you'll hear back from them, and what are you hoping to do maybe in Parliament next week?
Well, I don't know the answer to that question, Esther. Obviously, I hope as soon as possible. It is a rapidly changing situation, as we know, so I'd hope that they will be looking into it as soon as possible. And of course, I'll let you know when I hear. But throughout the pandemic, I've used every opportunity in Parliament to stand up for the interests of children. Obviously, children don't vote, and so sometimes they don't get a look in. But I think that's why it's so important as politicians, as MPs, that we do stand up for children's interests, whether that's keeping them in school, making sure they're protected, making sure that their interests are being followed. So, yeah, I'll be using any opportunity in Parliament that comes up this week to talk about this and to make sure that we really are acting in the welfare and the best interests of our children.
And Miriam, if the answer comes back, we've looked at it, we will reassess it, but you were wrong, we're still going to continue with this. Is this then, is this where you put your pen down and the cause is over, or will you continue again?
Well, the JCVI are the experts, and that's why I'm writing this letter, because I want them to look at the evidence and to make the recommendations. I mean, as Professor Taylor has said, our vaccination programme in this country has been phenomenal. And all these millions of adults who've voluntarily gone to get vaccinated because they trust it and because they know that it protects against serious illness and death. So the JCVI have got a good record on this. So I want them to make those recommendations. But I think whatever they say, the important thing is that it continues to be the choice of the parents and the child, as it has been so far. And as we've seen, about half of children and parents have taken that up, half haven't. So for me, the most important thing is that it continues to be personal choice and that families' views are respected.
Thank you very much indeed. And Professor Brent Taylor, thank you very much indeed. And we'll follow this story with interest because it was broken here on GB News.